Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Thanks so much for joining us for the next session. Today, as I said, we're going to be covering a little bit more of the high level, and I don't mean that in the sense of lack of detail, but really high level in the sense going from kind of the top down. What is senior management doing? How can we be strategic about the roles of disclosures? And I think one of the things that's worth mentioning here is the fact that while we are talking about TCFD and how to make an effective TCFD disclosure, that's really not the end all. It's related to the broader practice of effective risk management, of identifying the right opportunities for your company and your institution. And so as a result, what that means is that there's a really significant need to see these activities not just as reporting burdens, but as ways of integrating good practice into your operations going forward. And in that way, then the reporting becomes something that you do on the existing activities rather than something that you do in order to make the report. And I think that is particularly stark in these next two disclosures, because very often people say, oh, like, what should we do for the governance, or what should we do in the context of the disclosure? And I think in some ways that is a limiting view. I think the view should be, what are the procedures and policies we need? And what are the strategies we should be looking at, and how should we be setting them? And then it becomes much more natural to talk about how we disclose them. So we will show good practice examples in this session, as well as in others. But the desire and design here is not for you to take away from this, oh, well, that's the one way to do it, or, oh, that's the only way that we can effectively make our disclosure, and more to think beyond the disclosure. What are the practices? And as we see progression, the constant feedback that stakeholders give on reporting is they want it to be more comparable, more quantifiable, and more standardized in terms of what is being disclosed. So in some of the work that we've done at UNFFI, the desire is to bring that perspective and that vision. And so for this next section, as I mentioned, I'm really glad to have my colleague, Maheen Arshad, join me. She has worked with a number of the scenario providers, as well as with Cicero, one of the leading climate research institutions based out of Norway, NISR, based in Great Britain, who is one of the partners for the NGFS on their latest run, doing economic modeling. But ultimately, a lot of that scenario work is relevant in strategy setting, because when we're talking about these long-term pathways, when we're talking about what are the different trade-offs that we have to make between physical and transition risks, about challenges to our operations, these scenarios are a window into that. And not that they are a prediction, but they are an opportunity to really explore some of those in a meaningful way. And so I think you're in very good hands with Maheen, who will go through that. And then at the top of the hour, we'll conclude both with the final session on governance, as well as with a final session on just any open questions from this day one. So over to you, Maheen.
Great, thanks, David. I also have my colleague Leah on the line, and I'm just going to ask her to share her screen for your presentation.
Great, looks good.
Yeah, so as David mentioned today, I'm here to talk about climate risk strategy setting as part of the TCFD disclosure. So this presentation is basically going to provide an introduction to the importance of strategy as a pillar for TCFD, as well as it's going to cover why it matters to incorporate climate risk into strategy setting and understanding their impacts. The presentation is also going to include a discussion on good practices for strategy disclosure, including the use of climate scenarios. So the main objective of this session is to help participants develop understanding and knowledge towards strategy development and for effectively disclosing strategy in light of climate risks and opportunities. So next slide. So as the first part of this presentation, I'm just going to provide an introduction to strategy. So as you can see, strategy is one of the 4 main pillars of TCFD, and strategy disclosures basically revolve around the actual and potential impacts of climate risks and climate opportunities for an organization's internal strategy, planning, and business. So the strategy pillar for TCFD disclosure can provide insights to the types of climate risks and opportunities, their magnitude, as well as the time horizon for these exposures to help understand potential impacts of these risks. It's important for strategy disclosures to then address how an institution can integrate the risk and opportunities that they have identified into their own internal strategy setting, as well as their financial planning. So as you can see on this slide, the TCFD provides 3 recommended disclosures in relation to strategy. So to quickly give an overview on those, the disclosures have 3 main components, which is the identification of climate risk and opportunities that an institution is exposed to, then the impact of these risks on your business, strategy, financial planning over time horizons, and then it's to understand how resilient the organization's strategies are. So how will your current strategies be affected by climate risks as well as opportunities, and how do these strategies need to change in order to address these exposures in relation to climate change. Next slide. So this slide basically highlights the importance of climate risk strategy. So as you can see, it highlights 2 main reasons for why climate strategy is important, which is for managing risk and setting climate targets. So on the left-hand side, you can see that integrating the impact of climate risks and opportunities into an institution's business strategy as well as planning can be useful. Firstly, because it can help the organization gain a better understanding of exposures to climate risk, especially regional exposures, such as it can help organizations understand climate risks which are specific to Ireland. It's also important to understand climate risk because it allows organizations to then adapt their strategies and make financial decisions, taking these into consideration to help build resilience to climate change and to minimize exposure or losses through various methods. It's also important to consider climate for strategy by taking various climate scenarios into account, because as mentioned, it can help build resilience. So scenario analysis can help institutions identify potential climate risk and to help understand the importance of for organizations to align to climate targets. And strategy disclosures is then a very useful way for institutions to then understand their role in reducing the impact of climate risk to meet climate targets. Next slide, please. So this is a quote by Mark Carney, and I think it does a really good job of illustrating the importance of integrating climate risk into strategies to help build resilience. Yeah, so for the next part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about good practices surrounding climate risk strategy disclosures. So this slide provides a good overview of the good practices for TCFD disclosure and an overview on the guidance provided. And in the following slides, I'm going to be going over these good practices in greater detail. But just to start off, I'll just like to summarize some of the main points, which is that when disclosing climate strategies, it's very important to characterize the risks and opportunities that you have identified according to the TCFD's classification, so it's very important to stick to the TCFD typology. So for example, physical risk should be characterized as acute or chronic. Similarly, transition risk should be characterized as regulatory, market, technology, or reputational. It's also very important to look at different time horizons, so short-term, medium-term, long-term, and like I said, we'll be going into greater detail in the coming slide, but when it comes to TCFD disclosure, it's very important to link time horizons to climate events over these time horizons, but also it's very important to link these time horizons to strategy setting. It's also useful to conduct climate scenario analysis for incorporating climate risk into your strategy. And in the disclosure, it's very important to discuss your analysis, and in do so, it's very important to do it in a very clear manner. Next slide. So as I mentioned, so in this slide, we're going to be talking about disclosing time horizons. So this slide is going to provide more guidance around disclosing short-term, medium-term, long-term time horizons, as well as emphasizing on the importance of providing justification for why these time horizons are used. So just for guidance, a disclosure in relation to time horizon should include a description of the horizons used, and if possible, then the years that were used should also be included. It's very important that an organization understands that climate impacts manifest over different time horizons. It's important to analyze them not only using short-term horizon, but medium-term and long-term, because climate risk manifests at different times. So for example, if you're looking at physical risk, some physical risk manifests over a medium-term horizon or a long-term horizon, but there are climate risks that manifest in the short term or are already starting to do so. Also, when deciding on time horizons to use, it's important to also disclose the time horizons used internally. So currently, the time horizons are used for internal forecasts, as well as to consider, for example, as a financial institution, the weighted average life of a portfolio. And as I mentioned, it's very important that time horizons are linked to your strategy settings. So short-term, medium-term, long-term horizons need to be linked to the overall business strategy, as well as to the climate risk that we looked at. Next slide, please. So this slide provides an example on disclosing time horizons. So this example is provided by ING in their report from 2020. So as you can see on the slide, the figure is of their climate alignment dashboard. So what ING did was then analyze various sectors, as you can see. So they looked at power generation, aviation, shipping, and they set one portfolio target per sector to help them in sector alignment with the Paris Agreement. So what the climate alignment dashboard on your screen shows is for each sector, it is the carbon intensity over various time horizons. So the years are plotted from 2019 to 2040 in the report, and it displays the climate alignment portfolio, so per sector, and it compares it to other decarbonization pathways to see their portfolio target over various time horizons. And I think this is a very good example of how institutions can then disclose analysis of various time horizons to help with their strategy setting. So the next guidance is going to focus on the methodology and processes that should be used to help identify and assess climate risks and opportunities for strategy setting. So as I previously mentioned, what's really important for the disclosure is the categorization of the risks that are discussed. So they need to be in line with the TCFD characterization, and it's very important that these risks and opportunities are highly granular and detailed, and they're linked to the time horizons of your organization. So this section should then include climate risks and opportunities that are going to materialize and have a material impact on your organization. And it's very important to provide a description of the processes that were used by you to determine which risks and opportunities are going to have a financial impact on the organization. And what's really important here is that these climate risks should be characterized, and they should be categorized with the TCFD typology, but they should also be contextualized to your industry. So for example, when discussing climate risk for the banking industry, these risks should also be characterized as market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk, or operational risk. So it's also important to understand these climate risks under the context of your industry. Next slide, please. So this slide shows an example by Citigroup in their TCFD report from 2020 for disclosing risk and opportunities that they have assessed for their portfolios. So in order to determine which climate risks have an impact on the institution, Citigroup began with characterizing transition and physical risks. And as you can see, their characterizations are then in line with TCFD. So examples that they've given for transition risk include, new policies and low carbon technologies, and they've characterized physical risk as acute or physical. So in their TCFD report, the next step that they did was they began analyzing the impact of different climate risks on their various portfolios. So Citibank Amex is part of the Citigroup, and in their TCFD report, they conducted a portfolio analysis on their real estate portfolio. So they looked at their commercial real estate portfolios to see how different extreme weather events would impact their portfolio. So they were looking at the effects of flooding, storms, and wildfires on their property values and loan-to-value ratios, just to understand whether physical risk will have a material impact on their organization. Similarly, they conducted analysis on their agriculture portfolio as well. So they looked at the impacts of acute and chronic physical risks, and they were looking at how these risks might impact the price and yield of different agriculture products, which then in turn looked at the impact on revenue and cost of the goods sold, and looked at the probability of default of clients in their agriculture portfolio. And in order to do this, they used scenario analysis. So they looked at two different temperature scenarios, so like a 2 degrees one and a 4 degrees scenarios till the 2040 year for the analysis. And in their analysis, they then calculated how these physical risks would then cause changes to their gross profits and their various scenarios, and how do these risks then cause changes to their client risk of default, to understand whether physical risks actually do have a material impact on their organization. Next slide. So this slide then details disclosures for the processes and methodologies used to identify but also quantify climate risks and opportunities. So as I mentioned before, it's very important that for your TCFD disclosure, when it comes to strategy, to describe the risks and opportunities that are going to have a materialized financial impact on the organization. So in order to do so, it's also very important to quantify these impacts. So for when it comes to strategy disclosure, it's important to then describe these risks, but also discuss which lines of business are going to be impacted from these climate risks or opportunities. It's also recommended to mention any past climate impacts. An organization should also discuss the impacts on any overarching goals or current capital expenditure, the impact on investments, as well as any estimated costs and impacts from these climate risks and opportunities. And then in order to quantify these risks, it's very important to describe why specific metrics were chosen and any underlying calculations or methodologies used to demonstrate the impact of these risks and opportunities. So next slide. So this is another example from Citi, and as you can see, I think this is a very good example by the institution on the use of metrics to quantify the impact of certain climate opportunities. So what the image on the screen shows is Citi's program of innovative environmental finance transactions from 2020. So it shows the impact of investments in renewables, clean energies, improved building efficiencies. And as you can see, they've used various metrics to demonstrate their environmental impacts. Next slide. So a very important part of the strategy disclosure is looking at resilience, so understanding how business strategies are going to be impacted by climate risk and how resilient the organization will be. So it's very important that when it comes to looking at resilience of strategies to incorporate scenario analysis. So this would include, and we'll talk about in more details about scenario analysis in the coming slides as well as tomorrow, but for a quick overview, so under resilience strategy, it's very important that organizations consider both physical and transition risk together and look at the impact of both of them combined together, as well as it's important for organizations to then plan how their current strategies will change in light of these risks and opportunities that were identified from scenario analysis, and to look at how these results can then be used and integrated into different projects as well as internal decisions. Next slide. Yeah, so the next few slides, I'll be talking about scenario analysis in the context of climate strategy. So this slide provides an overview on the different applications of climate scenarios. So as you can see that climate scenarios is becoming a very important tool when it comes to strategy setting and risk management in light of climate risk, and it has various uses. So it's useful for identifying and assessing climate risk and opportunities. So it's very important for climate related disclosures as well as internal reporting. Scenario analysis also has an important role to play in underwriting, so it can help a particular industry or a client to help make decisions as well. Scenario analysis also has a big component to play in climate stress testing to determine resiliency of the financial system to different scenarios, as well as mentioned, it's very important for climate strategy setting as well as limits and targets to help a well understood pathway. So the slide provides a quick overview on climate scenarios and their importance with a specific example from the NGFS. So climate scenarios are useful in exploring different possible pathways of climate change and to see potential different futures of different scenarios, and it can be used by organizations to see whether it's useful for organizations to determine long-term goals, long-term climate goals. So as you can see on the right-hand side, that's an example provided by the NGFS, and their three main scenarios. So orderly, disorderly, and hothouse world. So that allows a viewer to see different possible pathways for emissions, and then can be used to use for internal strategy and planning. So for example, with your orderly scenario, that is if there is no delay in implementing climate policies, carbon tax and actions are taken immediately. With disorderly, there is a delay and which leads to more stringent policies being applied. And then there is the hothouse world scenario, in which there are no additional policies, so only the current policies. And as you can see, that these different scenarios have different pathways. So as mentioned, can you go back? Sorry. Yeah, thank you. So as mentioned, these scenarios are useful for organizations to look at how different climate policies, different action can have an impact on their organization and can help identify different exposures. Yeah, next. So when it comes to disclosing scenario analysis, so it's very important to show how scenario analysis was used to identify vulnerabilities, and then how it can be then incorporated into strategies to improve resilience. So it's very important when disclosing scenario analysis to provide a review of the analysis itself, but also justification as to why certain scenarios were picked, why are they applicable to your organization, and how they can be used to help support your internal strategy. It's also important then when discussing scenario analysis that physical and transition risks are considered jointly as well, and their interaction is also assessed. Next slide. So here's a case study by UBS in their sustainability report from 2020, and it really provides a good example on disclosing scenario analysis. So as you can see that UBS has been performing scenario analysis since 2014 on their exposures to physical and transition risks. So in their report, they've provided a table on the various assessments that they've conducted, which year they've conducted them, the scenarios they've used, as well as the outcomes. And as you can see that early on, starting in 2014, UBS used internal scenario analysis, but over the years, they have modified and updated their scenario analysis by collaborating with industry experts, and they've now performed scenario analysis using the NGFS scenarios by collaborating with Cicero, and they've performed analysis using various time horizons. So they've looked at both short, medium, and long term, as well as looking at different exposures to different sectors as well.